Imagine standing in a snowstorm knowing you are about to die. Your dynasty is ruined, and your son's body has been cut into pieces and nailed to the gates of 5 different English cities by the very king you put on the throne. What do? If you are the Earl of Northumberland, you don't run. You draw your sword. This is the story of the Battle of Bramham Moor, a brutal clash in the winter of 1408 that destroyed the last great challenger to the English crown, and proved that in medieval politics, making a king is the easiest way to sign your own death warrant. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Bramham Moor, where Henry IV destroyed the last great noble challenger to the Lancastrian throne, and where a family that had once made kings finally paid the price for trying to unmake one. But before we get to that snowstorm and that final charge, we need to understand what the Percy family actually was, and why Henry IV owed them everything and feared them in equal measure. The Percys of Northumberland were not simply powerful noblemen. They were, in a very practical sense, the north of England. For generations the family had held the wardenship of the Scottish Marches, the border territories where English and Scottish sovereignty blurred into a perpetual, low-level war of raids, counter-raids, and negotiated truces. Their castles at Alnwick, Warkworth, Bamborough, and Prudhoe formed the defensive spine of the entire northern frontier. Their private armies, funded by vast northern estates, were the force that actually kept the border. Without the Percys, the north was undefended. With them, it was a kingdom within a kingdom. This was not a recent arrangement. The Percys had been building this position since the Norman conquest, accumulating land and offices, and marriage alliances across the north of England and the border territories. By the late 14th century, the first Earl of Northumberland had accumulated a concentration of military and administrative power in the north that no other noble family in England could match. He was in the most practical sense a king of a different kind, ruling by force of arms and personal loyalty rather than by divine right, but ruling nonetheless. Henry Percy, the first Earl of Northumberland, had fought for England his entire life. He had been Marshal of England, Admiral of the Northern Seas, Warden of the Marches. He had served 3 kings. When Henry Bolingbroke arrived from exile in 1399 to claim the throne that Richard II was sitting on, Percy made a calculation that would define the rest of his life. He threw the Percy weight, the men, the money, the northern loyalty, behind Bolingbroke. Without that support, the coup almost certainly fails. Richard II survives. Bolingbroke goes back into exile or goes to the block. England takes a different path entirely. Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV. Percy became Constable of England and received the sovereignty of the Isle of Man. The 2 men stood together at the height of their power, the king and the Kingmaker. The crack appeared almost immediately. The Percy family's understanding of their arrangement with Henry was, essentially, that they were partners. They had made him king. In return, they expected to be treated as something close to co-rulers of the north, their military expenses reimbursed, their political authority respected, their family interests protected. Henry's understanding was different. He was the king. They were his subjects. Grateful subjects, perhaps, but subjects nonetheless. The breaking point came in 1402. At the Battle of Homildon Hill, Percy's son, Henry Hotspur, the most celebrated soldier in England, destroyed a Scottish army that had been raiding the north. The victory was complete and profitable. The prisoners taken included the Earl of Douglas and numerous Scottish noblemen, each one representing a substantial ransom. This was how medieval warfare worked. You took prisoners, you held them, their families paid to get them back, and the victor funded his next campaign on the proceeds. Henry IV forbade the ransoms. The prisoners were to be surrendered to the crown. The Percys would receive nominal compensation. The king would take the financial benefit of a victory the Percys had won. This was, in Percy's reading of it, theft. It was also a signal. The king was strong enough now that he no longer needed to keep the Percy family financially comfortable. The relationship had shifted. They were no longer partners. They were just very large subjects who needed to be watched. To compound the insult, Henry also refused to pay the ransom demanded for Edmund Mortimer, Hotspur's brother-in-law, who had been captured fighting in Wales. The king's message was clear. The Percy's interests were no longer his concern. He had the throne. He no longer needed them. The explosion came in 1403. Hotspur raised his standard against the king, riding south to link up with Welsh rebels under Owain Glyndwr and the Mortimer family, who had a claim to the throne that was arguably more legitimate than Henry's own. The plan was to catch the king before he could concentrate his forces. Henry moved with extraordinary speed. At Shrewsbury on July 21st, 1403, he intercepted Hotspur's army before the junction with Glyndwr could happen. The battle was savage. 2 English armies, each fielding longbowmen, shredding each other's formations with the same weapon that had won Crecy and Agincourt. Hotspur died in the fighting, a lucky arrow through the gap in his visor at the moment he raised it to breathe. The old Earl of Northumberland had not been at Shrewsbury. The chroniclers disagree on why. Some say illness prevented him from marching in time. Some say his forces were not yet assembled. Some suggest a deliberate calculation that left his options open depending on which way the battle went. Whether delayed by illness, misfortune, or cold calculation, he arrived too late. His son died alone on a Shropshire hillside, with the king's army closing in and no Percy banner coming over the ridge to his relief. Whatever the truth, the old man spent the remaining 5 years of his life with that question following him. Henry IV stripped him of his northern commands, but let him live. There was insufficient evidence to charge him with treason directly, and the submission of England's most powerful northern lord was politically useful. For 2 years Percy submitted. He attended court. He gave his pledges of loyalty. Behind the scenes he was doing something else entirely. In February 1405, Percy put his name to one of the most audacious political documents of the medieval period, the Tripartite Indenture, a secret agreement between himself, Owain Glyndwr of Wales, and Edmund Mortimer. The plan was to depose Henry IV and divide England into 3 separate kingdoms. Percy would take the north, Glyndwr would take Wales and the western marches. Mortimer would rule the south, 3 kingdoms where one had stood. The plan collapsed within months. The Archbishop of York, Richard le Scrope, raised his banner in the north as part of the same conspiracy. Henry IV moved north with merciless efficiency. The Earl of Westmoreland, Ralph Neville, the Percy family's great rival, who had been building his own power base in the north with royal backing for years, lured Scrope and his co-conspirators into a negotiation and arrested them. The Archbishop was executed. Percy and his closest ally Lord Bardolph fled to Scotland. They spent 3 years in exile. Scotland, Wales, France, Flanders, seeking support, seeking money, seeking an army, finding very little. Glyndwr's power was breaking. The French had their own problems. The Scottish lords who had seemed willing to help grew cautious when Henry IV proved stubbornly hard to kill or depose. By the winter of 1407, Percy was 66 years old, running out of time and running out of options. He had 1 card left to play. He still had the Percy name, and in the north, that name still meant something. The king was ill, seriously ill, though reports of exactly how ill varied. Perhaps this was the moment. Perhaps if he crossed the border with whatever men he could gather, the north would rise. He gathered his force in Scotland, a modest collection of Scottish knights, northern English exiles who had followed him across the border, and a few hundred men who owed him personal loyalty. It was not the army of 1403. It was what an old man in exile could scrape together from the ruins of what had once been the greatest private military force in England. They crossed the border in February 1408. The winter was brutal. Thick snow, frozen roads, the kind of cold that turns plate armour into a refrigerator. Percy rode south into Yorkshire, taking a few small positions as he went, and issued proclamations calling on the people to rise against Henry's tyranny and taxation. Almost nobody answered. The mass uprising he had been counting on did not materialise. What he did not fully know was that the Yorkshire sheriff, Sir Thomas Rokeby, had been watching him. Some chroniclers suggest Rokeby had gone further, had sent messages to Percy while he was still in Scotland, encouraging him to cross the border, hinting that support was waiting, drawing the old man into a trap. Whether this was deliberate deception or simply the information gap that plagued medieval campaigning, Percy arrived in Yorkshire to find not a rising, but a waiting army. Rokeby had assembled the local levies, the loyal knights of Yorkshire, and the retinues of those northern lords who had made their choice for Lancaster. He positioned himself between Percy and any route south or back to Scotland, closing the trap. Percy found himself at Bramham Moor with Rokeby to his west and no viable line of retreat. On the morning of February 19th, the two forces faced each other across the snow-covered moorland. Rokeby raised the banner of St. George. Percy raised his own arms. The trumpets sounded. Rokeby had positioned his force with care. He knew what he was facing, an army that had been marching through bitter winter conditions for days. Men cold to the bone and short of supplies, Scottish infantry unaccustomed to English longbow fire at close range, and levies who had answered Percy's call more out of old loyalty than military conviction. Against them Rokeby placed his Yorkshire men in good order, rested and provisioned, the longbowmen with clear sightlines across the open moorland and solid ground underfoot despite the snow. Rokeby's longbowmen went to work first. On the flat moor there was nowhere to shelter and no terrain to break the approach. Percy's men had to absorb the arrow storm or charge straight into it. Percy's force, smaller, less disciplined, composed partly of Scottish infantry and exhausted levies, had no effective answer. In the freezing air, the longbows drove their shafts through gambesons and mail that were already stiffened by the cold. The Scottish infantry, brave enough but lightly armoured compared to English men-at-arms, took terrible casualties before they could close the distance. The formations began to fracture under the archery before the hand-to-hand fighting had properly started. When the infantry advance came, the battle became what the chroniclers describe as short, fierce and bloody. Rokeby's men were fighting for a king whose legitimacy they accepted. Percy's men were fighting for an exile's last gamble. The difference showed. Percy's lines broke. What happened next is recorded in the chronicles with a kind of sad respect that the man had earned despite everything. The Earl of Northumberland did not run. He could have. There were moments in the chaos of a medieval defeat when a man of sufficient rank and determination could slip away. He chose not to. He placed himself at the rear of his retreating force, buying his men time with his own body, and fought until he was overwhelmed and killed. Lord Bardolph was taken alive, badly wounded. He died of his wounds that same evening. The two clergymen who had ridden with Percy's army faced different fates. The Abbot of Hales had come to battle in full plate armour. The law was unambiguous. A clergyman who bore arms in rebellion had abandoned the protection of the church and would be treated as a secular traitor. He was hanged. The Bishop of Bangor, Griffin Younger, was wearing his ecclesiastical vestments and had not borne arms. He was spared. The Crown had no desire to repeat the diplomatic catastrophe of Archbishop Scrope's execution 3 years earlier. Young eventually made his peace with the papacy and returned to service. The clothing on your back, in that moment, was the difference between life and death. Henry IV had the heads of Percy and Bardolph placed on London Bridge. Their bodies were quartered and the pieces sent to towns across the kingdom: Lincoln, Berwick, Newcastle, York. The same ritual that had been performed on Hotspur's body in 1403 was now performed on the father. After months of display, when the political point had been adequately made, the pieces were gathered and Henry Percy was buried at York Minster, beside the son he had not been there to save at Shrewsbury. The Percy lands, the Percy castles, the wardenship of the Scottish marches, all of it went to the Nevilles. Ralph Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland, who had been accumulating northern power throughout all of this, now stood without rival as the dominant force in the north. He had been the right choice for Henry IV all along. He had delivered at every crisis. The Percy family did not disappear. Henry Hotspur's son, the old Earl's grandson, was eventually restored as the second Earl of Northumberland under Henry V. The name, the blood, the memory survived, and the bitterness between Percy and Neville, compounded by everything that had happened between 1399 and 1408, did not fade. It curdled over the following decades into something that would eventually consume both families, and much of England with them. The Wars of the Roses did not begin at Bramham Moor, but Bramham Moor is one of the places where the conditions that made those wars possible were established. Percy loyalty to Lancaster, Neville power in the north given to them at Percy expense, a family with grievances and memories, and the name to raise armies. When the Lancastrian dynasty began to fracture in the 1450s, all of it came back. Sir Thomas Rokeby, who had won the battle and saved the north for Lancaster, was rewarded with Percy estates and went on to fight at Agincourt 7 years later. He died in France in the service of Henry V, having served his king faithfully from the moment he raised the banner of St. George on a snowy moorland in Yorkshire and called the old lion out to die. There is a stone in a field near Bramham village, Percy Cross it is called, marking roughly where the Earl fell. The church at Bramham has the graves of men who died that day without names that history recorded. The moor itself is farmland now, ordinary and quiet. Shrewsbury planted the seeds. Bramham Moor brought in the harvest. That's what happened at the Battle of Bramham Moor.